Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next session on internal security. Now, we will be starting with the next chapter and we will look at the next conflict zone where India has faced some incredible challenges over the decades. I'm referring to the northeast of India, which has been affected by multiple insurgencies over the decades. This is another important chapter and it's also a very complex topic because the northeast of India has suffered from multiple insurgencies. Over the last 75 odd years, from 1947 till now, there have been multiple insurgencies that have affected different states in Northeast India. There have been at least 50 to 60 different armed groups that have posed a major security challenge to India. So let's take a look at Northeast India. Let's understand why the region has been so vulnerable for insurgency. What kind of security threats and challenges have we faced in this region? Were there any cross-border factors involved? How has India tackled the threat and what is the current situation? If you look at the northeast of India, we refer to the states present here as the seven sister states. It includes Sikkim, Assam, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, and Tripura. These seven northeastern states, they have faced many challenges over the decades, but some of them have been deeply affected by insurgency which has hit the region. If you look at this map, you easily get to know the geographical factors that define the Northeast region. Amongst all the northeastern states, Sikkim is one state which has not been affected by insurgency. Even Arunachal Pradesh, both Sikkim and Arunachal, they have been free from any local insurgencies. They have not been affected by any of the insurgencies that the region has witnessed. But the other states, Assam, even Meghalaya, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Tripura, they have faced a major challenge which has threatened the internal security and national security of India. Arunachal Pradesh also has been affected by the other insurgent groups. Arunachal does not have any local insurgency, but insurgents from Assam, from Nagaland, and other parts of Northeast India, they've used Arunachal Pradesh for their terror operations. In that regard, Arunachal Pradesh also has been destabilized, but there are no local insurgencies within Arunachal Pradesh. That's why I told you Sikkim and Arunachal are free from any native insurgencies, but the other states have been deeply affected by multiple insurgent movements. So first, let's understand why the region is so vulnerable. How come in one region so many insurgencies got triggered? What were the motives of these insurgent groups, right? What were they trying to achieve? What threat did they pose to India? These are various important questions that need to be answered. Now, first, let me explain the common factors. The common factors from Northeast India, which has been responsible for aiding so many insurgent movements. I want to take you through the geographical factors, including the demographic factors of Northeast India, that helps answer this particular question. How come this part of India has been affected by so many insurgencies as compared to any other region in the country? There has to be something unique about the region. And this has to do with the unique geography and demography of Northeast India. The unique geography and demography of Northeast India has played this role, a direct role, which has made Northeast India so vulnerable for the rise of so many insurgent movements. Now, of course, we will not sit and study every insurgency in Northeast India. It's not needed for the exam. As I told you, throughout the last 75 years, we have seen at least 50 to 60 different armed groups operating here. It's impossible to study all of them and remember them for the exam. UPSC will not focus on every insurgent movement. But based on my research, based on the questions that have been asked, I have shortlisted some important topics that we are going to cover. We will focus on these affected states, especially Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, and Tripura. And here I will select a few important insurgent organizations which have posed the biggest threat to India in the Northeast. We will not be covering Meghalaya because Meghalaya is by and large very stable in the last few years. The local insurgencies have come to an end. There are few incidents here and there, but by and large, Meghalaya has become free from insurgency. But the other states, they still face some issues, or at least in the past, they were very badly affected by insurgency. So in this chapter, we will focus on Nagaland, discuss Naga insurgency. We'll focus on Assam, and I'll pick some important insurgencies from Assam, be it Ulfa, the Bodo insurgency, and few other important movements in Assam. We'll take a look at Manipur. Given what has happened in the last year, Manipur is an important topic. It's a pressing issue. We will study the various factors in Manipur which has contributed to the current situation, how it is related to the insurgency that the state had suffered from back in 1960s and 70s. We will study insurgency in Mizoram, in Tripura, and how India has tackled the threats in these states. But before we get into the details, before we take up every state and study these insurgencies, let us understand the common factors in Northeast India, which has made the region so vulnerable. Because what if UPSC asks a 10 or 15 mark question, asking you to examine the vulnerability of Northeast India for security threats? UPSC might ask you to explain why Northeast India has suffered from so many insurgencies over the decades. So you have to write these few points that I'm going to mention, which is related to the unique geography and demography of the region. So please make a note of these points along with me as I discuss and explain them. And in the answer, if the question comes, you can draw a rough map of Northeast India as well, because that will help you present those arguments better. So let us take a look at these unique geographic, demographic factors, starting with the first point. The first point that comes to my mind is that if you look at the society of Northeast India, the demography of the region, you will realize that Northeast India is a multi-ethnic society. It's a very diverse society. There are multiple ethnic groups and indigenous tribal groups that make up this region. From Assam to Tripura, from Nagaland to Mizoram, there are multiple ethnic groups present here, multiple native, indigenous, tribal communities that are present over here. This ethnic diversity of Northeast India is related to the threat of insurgency that the region has faced. Because please understand that native ethnic groups and tribes, they are very protective of their land. They are very protective about their resources and also about their cultural identity. If you remember, we studied this under Naxalism as well, while talking about the tribal belt of Chhattisgarh, Odisha, and while discussing why a support base exists for Naxalism in the tribal pockets of central and eastern India, I had explained these factors. Anywhere in the world, indigenous communities are very protected. They are quite aggressive as well to protect their land, their identity and culture. It's very natural because they have very limited outside contact, outside influence. They see any outside interference as a threat to their very existence and their survival. Because many of these ethnic and tribal groups, they reside in the forests. They dwell in the forests. The forest is their homeland for centuries. The agriculture they practice, their livelihood is dependent on the forest itself and the resources they draw from the forest. They will have few traditional practices. They will practice basic agriculture, basic hunting, right? They will extract minor forest produce, and that is what sustains their life. So their land, their forest resources is everything for these tribal communities and ethnic groups. If you try to take that away from them, they are left with nothing. It threatens their very survival and their existence. And that is why indigenous tribal communities are very protective of their land and resources. They would be following their own unique tribal customs when it comes to their religion, their faith and belief, the gods they worship, the customs that they practice. That is all unique to them. They often speak a unique tribal language. This is their cultural identity. So if there is any kind of interference from another ethnic group or a tribe, or even from other outside forces, they automatically perceive this as a threat and they tend to react aggressively to those threats. If you have seen, let's say, movies like Avatar or even Triple R for that matter, they quite well depict the sensitivities of tribal communities and indigenous communities. Right? This is understandable. It is a genuine concern of these ethnic tribes and domestic indigenous communities. So these groups, right, especially in Northeast India, they have faced a lot of outside pressure, outside exploitation. For example, under the colonial British rule, many of these tribes and ethnic communities were exploited. For the British, their priority was only economic exploitation. All the laws that they made, the way they administered the region, it was all designed to serve the colonial economic interests. That way, British were very smart and shrewd because they never tried to occupy this whole region for themselves. They realized that it's going to be difficult to control ethnic tribes and indigenous communities. So in many places, they gave them autonomy. They did not fully annex these areas into British India, right? Even even though they could have done it, they gave a sense of autonomy, political autonomy to these communities, allowed them to run their administration and their affairs. In return, the British expected economic access to the precious forest resources of Northeast India. Now, after the British, certain policies of Government of India post-independence has been perceived as a threat by certain tribes and ethnic groups. It could be the forest conservation laws. In fact, the very integration of the region into the Indian Union was seen as a forceful merger by many ethnic groups and tribes. Because certain groups, they felt that they had nothing in common with rest of India. Culturally, historically, they were independent. They were largely disconnected from rest of India. So during the formation of Union of India, following independence from British rule, there was a lot of hesitance and resistance as well from certain ethnic groups and tribes to join India. When India ensured that these areas merged with the Union, it was seen as a forceful merger because they felt that the Government of India would never understand their concerns. Their access to their land and resources could be threatened. Their cultural identity could be compromised. So there was this hesitation and even resistance against joining India amongst several ethnic groups and tribal groups. So this already had become a factor for resentment against the Indian state. The perception that it was a forceful merger with India had given rise to a sentiment amongst certain groups in certain regions here that this was a forceful merger. They saw this almost like an annexation, and local resentment had built up against India right from independence. This is a key factor which we cannot ignore. Understood? Then post independence, there was a sense of neglect, a sense of isolation felt in this region. The people here felt that the Indian government sitting far away in Delhi doesn't care about the region. And this was true to an extent. For many decades, India did not adequately develop the region. Right? It was not just complacency and neglect. There were very difficult factors as well that prevented India from focusing on the region. There were many other economic challenges to deal with. There were geographical factors which limited India's reach and access to Northeast India. India itself was a very poor country struggling with multiple problems, right? So it was both a mixture of neglect and a genuine failure of the Indian state. So from 1950s to 1990s, during those 40 years, Northeast India largely felt neglected. They saw that other parts of the country were developing, better infrastructure was getting created, but Northeast India was getting left behind. Very poor connectivity, poor access was provided with limited economic opportunities. Poor connectivity with limited economic opportunities. Education, healthcare suffered. There were some disasters which took place and the Indian government didn't do enough. Job and livelihood opportunities were not created. So these economic factors, developmental factors, they also created the sense of resentment and in fact increased the sense of resentment. This led many of the tribal groups and ethnic groups to feel that they were getting neglected, that rest of the country didn't care about them, and they felt that they were alienated from the rest of India. So this was a cultural factor and a developmental factor. This was a cultural and developmental factor. There were genuine developmental issues. The lack of development, poor administration, poor governance played a very big role. And by now you have understood the linkages between development and extremism. You know what happens if a region is neglected and not developed, right? Plus, there was a cultural factor as well that added to the complication. And in fact, you can understand, you can empathize with these ethnic groups and tribal groups from Northeast India, because it is true that the rest of India has largely ignored, neglected, and even alienated the Northeast region. Even today, I'm talking about 2023, look at the attention our media gives to Northeast India. Look at the space that our popular entertainment gives to Northeast India. You look at Bollywood, you look at any other Indian movies or even web series and TV serials. Look at the priority, the focus they provide to Northeast India. It's very, very limited. It's negligible. Now, don't think this is a silly factor, silly point I'm raising. It's a very important point. In other parts of India, there is this sense that people from Northeast India, they're not Indians. There is an element of racial discrimination as well. Because people from Northeast India have Mongoloid features, which ties them with China, Southeast Asia, etc. There is rampant racial discrimination in other parts of India, even today. Believe it or not, students from Northeast India who come to Delhi, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Kolkata to study, to work, they don't even get a rented accommodation. They struggle to find PGs and rented accommodation because there is an element of suspicion, an element of racial discrimination. You would have seen incidents where people from other parts of India have often called people from Northeast India as Chinese or Chingies. This is a racial term which you cannot use to label people of a particular region. This is discrimination, right? So this is something that has persisted, it has prevailed, and it exists even today. In other parts of India, it is a reality that people from Northeast India are racially discriminated because of how they look and because of where they come from. This naturally creates a further sense of alienation. It creates a feeling that Indians don't care about people from Northeast India. The government also has not cared about the region. Now, see, let's say there are floods in Brahmaputra, in the Brahmaputra Valley. There is a disaster parallelly in, let's say, Mumbai. There's an urban flooding in Mumbai. The media will get obsessed with the urban flooding incident in Mumbai while paying very little attention to the devastating floods in Assam. That is the discrimination, the divide that I'm talking about. The lack of representation from the region, right? Across our popular media. How many Bollywood movies have touched upon issues from Northeast, right? How many popular media works have dealt with Northeast issues? Very few, very limited. How many actors, singers, or even sports personalities from Northeast India are popular across the country? Very few. This sense of neglect and alienation, the sense of isolation, it has already played a big role in creating that sense of resentment. So on one hand, there have been developmental factors due to the general neglect of the region and the geographical difficulties here. Plus, there are these cultural factors as well. So this has played a very big role in increasing that resentment, which leads to some of these separatist movements that we are going to study. The next very important point, if you look at the terrain of Northeast India, it's a very complex terrain. Now, please look at the map, focus where I'm pointing out. This is the Siliguri corridor, the narrow Siliguri corridor of India, which is a strategic choke point. Because this narrow land corridor of India, it is sandwiched between Nepal and Bangladesh. There are two international borders present, and between Nepal and Bangladesh, there is this narrow patch of India that passes through. It's hardly 22 to 60 kilometers wide. That is how narrow it is. Once you cross this choke point, once you cross the Siliguri corridor, you enter the Darjeeling region of West Bengal, known for its tea plantations. You move north, you will reach Sikkim. You move towards the east from here, you reach the Brahmaputra Valley. All right, you basically reach Northeast India, starting with Assam and then the other states. Now, if you have ever been to this region, if you have ever crossed Siliguri and crossed Darjeeling towards Northeast India, you would have noticed that the terrain here is hilly, mountainous. There are dense forests and jungles that dominate the geography here. There are major rivers and riverine networks which flood very frequently. The Brahmaputra and its tributaries, the Barak River, even the Teesta that comes down from Sikkim towards West Bengal, the Feni River, all these major rivers which eventually enter Bangladesh, right? They create a flood basin and a riverine network as well. So in such an area where there are hilly mountainous regions, dense forests and jungles, where there are rivers which flood frequently, it is not easy to create infrastructure. It's not easy to build roads, to build railway connectivity, to establish power plants. They are all essential to trigger growth, to trigger development. So it's not that Indian government always neglected the region. Yes, there was neglect, there was complacency. But at the same time, there were geographical challenges. It would have taken enormous efforts and costs to create that infrastructure. And as a result, the development of the region was indeed compromised. Even today, many parts of Northeast India, they are extremely remote. Some parts are almost inaccessible. So this geographical complexity creates further challenges. It further affects the development of the region. It even affects the movement of security troops to contain any crisis situation in the region. So the terrain plays a critical role, just like the multi-ethnic nature of the society has played a role. Is that clear? Now, I would like to add one more point over here. Since I was talking about the demography of Northeast India, right, I was telling that the ethnic tribes and groups, they feel threatened by any outside interference. They felt threatened not just by British rule and post-independent India, they have felt threatened historically by the dominant tribes and ethnic groups here. Understood? I'm referring to inter-tribal rivalry, inter-ethnic rivalry. Obviously, when so many tribes and ethnic groups are present, there will be few groups which are larger in number, which are more dominant politically, economically. There will be some smaller groups, minority groups. The smaller groups will obviously feel threatened by the more dominant groups which are dominating over them. Now, take for example the Assamese. The Assamese have been one of the most dominant ethnic groups in the region since the days of the Ahom kingdom. The Nagas, who are present in large numbers across Northeast India, they are a dominant ethnic group. But compared to Assamese and Nagas, there are other small tribes and ethnic groups such as Mizos, Kukis, subgroups of Nagas, Tripuris. These are all smaller tribes and ethnic groups, and they have felt discriminated and even dominated by the majority groups. This leads to inter-ethnic, inter-tribal rivalries. Look at what's happening in Manipur. The Manipur issue is essentially an ethnic problem. The majority Metis and the minority Kuki Zomis. The clashes are primarily between them, right? So inter-tribal rivalry, inter-ethnic rivalry is another major factor that you have to keep in mind. Inter-ethnic, inter-tribal rivalry. The smaller groups in particular feel threatened by the majority groups who are dominant, leading to differences between them, and it even turns into clashes and violence. Now, apart from all this, there are a number of cross-border factors that has an impact. There are many cross-border factors that plays a direct role in aiding insurgency in Northeast India. For example, the presence of multiple international borders. The whole region is surrounded by other countries. Correct? You have Nepal and Bangladesh over here. Then you have Bhutan. Then, of course, China and Myanmar. There are so many countries that bind this region from all the sides. Nepal and Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, Myanmar. And don't forget, the region is landlocked. Because in today's globalized economy, being a landlocked region is a disadvantage. There's no direct access to the sea. This affects the trade and economic opportunities available to the region. It affects connectivity as well. So being landlocked, it's harder for the region to develop, to connect with the rest of the world. With India as well, with rest of the country, that is, connectivity is limited because only route for connection is through Siliguri, right? Where there is a very difficult geography present and it's a very narrow choke point. That's the only route available for connectivity with rest of the country. So it has been difficult to transport goods, to transport equipment to the region in order to create the infrastructure and provide for development here. Plus, there are so many international borders, the region is landlocked, and the worst part is that some of these countries have been hostile to India. All right? Some of these neighboring countries, they have been hostile to India and they have provided covert support to some of the insurgent groups that have operated in the region. I'm referring to the support that countries like China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and to an extent from Myanmar as well, which some of the insurgent groups have received from across the border. China, Pakistan, obviously, they would have waged a covert war against India. Don't forget, Bangladesh at one point was Pakistan. It was East Pakistan until 1971. In 1960s itself, Pakistan had used East Pakistan to support few Northeast insurgent groups. We are going to study that later. China, especially after 1962 war, it has actively supported several Northeast insurgent groups as part of its covert proxy war against India. Bangladesh saw a few hostile governments from 1970s to early 2000. During those 30 years, Bangladesh became a safe haven for multiple Northeast insurgent groups. Bangladesh was ruled by a military dictatorship and then a hostile government under a party called BNP, Bangladesh Nationalist Party. These Bangladeshi governments were extremely hostile to India and they were pro-Pakistan. They allowed Pakistan a fertile ground in Bangladesh, and Bangladeshi state agencies were involved. Bangladeshi security forces and armed forces were involved in providing direct support to Northeast insurgent groups. They basically enjoyed a safe haven. They could hide in these countries, receive funds, weapons, and even training, and target India from across the border. Several groups have taken shelter in Myanmar because some of the ethnic groups in India are connected with ethnic groups on the other side in Myanmar. There are cross-border ethnic connections. Cross-border ethnic connections exist. Nagas on the Indian side are connected with Naga subgroups in Myanmar. They are culturally connected. They have familial ties with each other. The Mizos in Mizoram are connected to the Chins in Myanmar. The Kukis are connected to the Zomi community in Myanmar. These cross-border ethnic links has created a support base in Myanmar. These insurgents, they have crossed over from the Indian side and taken shelter in Myanmar, where they have received support from the local ethnic groups. Just like Northeast India, Myanmar itself has been affected by multiple insurgencies. These ethnic groups I'm mentioning, like Chins, Zomis, they also have taken up insurgency in Myanmar. So they actively support the insurgents on the Indian side, and they work together. They shelter them and they support each other. China has exploited Myanmar to wage this covert war against India, and through Myanmar, it has supplied funds and weapons to Northeast insurgents. So these cross-border factors play a critical role. And don't forget, we had studied the Golden Triangle in the last chapter. I hope you remember it. I had told you that to the east of India, there is this region called the Golden Triangle, which is the trijunction of Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos. This region is a hub of organized crime. All sort of illegal activities flourish in the Golden Triangle, especially in Myanmar and Thailand. From drug trafficking to arms trafficking, human and wildlife trafficking, and today even cyber crimes, cyber frauds, illegal online gambling, online scams, they all flourish in the Golden Triangle. There is constant instability in Myanmar because of the military rule, the persecution of minorities, and the current emergency that the military has imposed. The constant instability in Myanmar has created a fertile ground for criminal groups to flourish, insurgents to flourish, and there is this nexus between criminals, insurgents, and money laundering channels. So it has become very easy to operate in the Golden Triangle. These armed extremist groups, right? They can easily source weapons from here. They can raise funds by getting involved in human trafficking and wildlife trafficking, and also in cyber crimes and online scandals. They can smuggle drugs. They can raise a commission from that, right? They can use the drugs to get the youth addicted so that they are easier to brainwash and indoctrinate. So the criminal activities present here in Golden Triangle has played a very big role in influencing the security situation in Northeast India. This border itself, the India-Myanmar border in particular, this is a highly porous border, meaning there are many gaps in the border, natural gaps. Same with the Bangladeshi border. Even the Bangladesh border that we have here is a highly porous border. So when you have such porous borders, it can't be guarded easily. Border security becomes a very big challenge. Border security has been weak because it is so challenging to guard such boundaries. If you look at the Myanmar border, there are hilly mountainous areas, forested jungle areas, remote areas which are unconnected by road and rail. So it's not easy to move the troops and deploy them everywhere. It's not possible to fence the border as well, right? So the porous nature of the border makes it easy for the criminals and insurgents to cross over. So cross-border infiltration has been a major factor which has contributed to multiple insurgencies in Northeast India. So I think this gives you an overall picture about the Northeast region. This is the general discussion I wanted to have so that you can understand why the region is so badly affected by insurgency. All right, don't miss out on any of these points. One is the multi-ethnic nature of the society, which is a demographic factor. The presence of so many ethnic and tribal groups, inter-ethnic, inter-tribal rivalries, the fear of being exploited by outsiders, be it by colonial British or later by post-independent India, resistance towards merger with India, then the sense of neglect, alienation and isolation, cultural and racial discrimination and lack of development. Along with that, the geographical factors, the physical geography, the terrain of the region, the complex geography here, the border challenges, highly porous nature of the border with so many countries present around it, especially hostile countries which have directly supported these extremists. The cross-border ethnic connections, the presence of organized criminal hubs in Golden Triangle, easy availability of drugs, weapons, and other logistics to wage a war against India. So all these factors collectively have contributed to the vulnerability of Northeast region for so many insurgent movements. Now, I've explained all these points in detail as well in the next few slides. Whatever I discussed, whatever I wrote down, I've given those points in detail in the next few slides. You can go through that later. Is that clear? Please take a look at this later, the demography and geography of Northeast India. There are 4 separate slides where I've explained the same points that we discussed. Now, I was just trying to prepare you for a possible question, right? There can be a general question on Northeast India where UPSC will expect you to explain why the region is so vulnerable for so many insurgencies. Why have we seen so many threats in Northeast India? These are the points you have to write and illustrate with the help of a map to get your point across. Now, let me give you the chronological order in which different states were affected by insurgency. The first insurgency to break out here was the Naga insurgency in today's Nagaland. Back then, it was part of Assam itself. This was the first insurgency that India dealt with. In fact, even before India became independent, in 1947, Naga insurgency had broken out, which became a threat, a major threat since 1950s. Then, Insurgencies broke out in Manipur and Mizoram in 1960s. In 1970s, insurgency broke out in Assam and Tripura. Some of these insurgencies have persisted till date. There are few insurgent movements which are still active and they continue to pose a threat to India. So we will go in this order. I will start with Naga insurgency. Then I'll take up Assam. I'll jump ahead in timeline, but I want to cover the bigger states and the bigger issues first. So we look at Nagaland, Assam, Manipur, and then look at Mizoram and Tripura. As I told you earlier, we will not focus on Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, and Sikkim. Not needed. Why? Because Sikkim has never suffered from insurgency. Arunachal Pradesh has not seen any local insurgency, but other insurgents have used Arunachal Pradesh for moving to China and Myanmar. Meghalaya has suffered from insurgency, but today it has become by and large stable. Some of the tribal communities like the Garo, Kasi, Jaintias, and few other communities, they had their own armed groups. They had their own demands. Most of it has been dealt with, and today Meghalaya is very stable and peaceful. Although there are some minor incidents, right? It's not a very important topic for the exam. So there need not be a discussion on Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, and even Meghalaya. We'll focus on the other insurgencies that we have seen, and we will prioritize. We will be prioritizing a few important insurgent groups. Out of the 50, 60 odd armed groups we have seen here, we will mainly focus on maybe 8 to 10 of the top insurgent organizations. We'll understand their demands, why the insurgency started, what kind of support they received from abroad, what kind of threat they pose to India, and how India has tackled these outfits. That is exactly what we'll be studying. Now, before I start with Naga insurgency, I've given a summary of all the common general factors that we discussed. We can summarize this into 4 points. That is a sense of apathy, alienation from rest of India, struggle for identity amongst the tribes and ethnic communities, cross-border factors related to the geography of the region, and the prevalence of organized crime in Golden Triangle. If you can remember these points and present this with a map, you can easily answer such a question. And also this helps you in understanding the complexity involved in Northeast India, right? So we will prioritize the discussion based on the groups that have posed the biggest threat. We will focus on Naga insurgent outfits like NSCN, Assamese insurgent groups like ULFA, which was recently in news, UNLF, which is a Manipur-based outfit, and even PLA. Right? These are some major groups that we will focus upon. We'll also talk about the Mizo National Front, All Tripura Tiger Force, Kamtapur Liberation Organization, National Democratic Front of Bodoland. These are the major groups that we will be discussing in class. Many of these groups have been recently in news. We have signed peace deals with some of them. We are negotiating a peace accord with some of them. Some of them are still active and posing a threat to India. Right? These are the groups that have remained active for 30, 40 years and more than that. And they have honestly posed the biggest threat to India. So resolving these conflicts, weakening these groups and negotiating a peace accord with them will have the highest impact with regard to ensuring stability in the Northeast. So that is why I'm going to prioritize these organizations and their insurgent movements, which are more relevant for the exam. You can't sit and study all the 50, 60 insurgencies. It's impossible, right? And sometimes these insurgent groups, they have different factions. Like NSCN has at least 8 to 10 different factions. You need not sit and study about every faction of NSCN, right? So I will consolidate this for you. Don't worry. I'll try to simplify this. We will focus on few states, few insurgencies, and few insurgent groups, which are the most important for the exam. And how did I choose these topics? I have chosen these topics based on the threat that these groups have posed to India. I have chosen these topics based on questions that have come. And I have chosen these topics based on the impact that these groups have had in the Northeast. So let us start with Naga insurgency. Let's look at the first insurgency faced by independent India. By now, we have studied Naxalism, Khalistan movement, insurgency, terrorism in J&K. But this movement predates all of them. This was the first insurgency that affected India. And again, believe it or not, this started before India's independence. Even before India could be born officially, Naga insurgency had already broken out. So this is the longest lasting insurgency in the country. Let's say there is a prelims question. UPSC might ask this. Which is India's oldest insurgency? Which was the first insurgent movement we dealt with? The answer is Naga insurgency. It is active even today in 2023. So you can understand how impactful this insurgent movement has been with regard to the security of Northeast India. So we have to study this in detail. I'll take you through the entire history. I know the background might get a little boring, but trust me, I'll do my best to make it interesting. I'll try to make it like a story so that you can concentrate, you can understand what has happened. Because without understanding the root causes, you can never master these topics. You can't sit and by heart these statements and reproduce them in the answers. You have to develop a conceptual, analytical understanding, but I'm there to help you. I'll start from the basics. I'll go back in history, understand the developments, and see how Naga insurgency broke out, for what reason, how did it evolve, and how India tackled the threat, and what is the current status. So before I start with this, if you have any doubts, any questions, please let me know. I'll give you some time. Please let me know if you have any doubts until now, based on whatever we have studied. Gaurav is asking, sir, do these groups have territorial control? Some of these groups have sought territorial control. These were insurgent outfits, so they obviously had a territorial objective, meaning they wanted to separate these areas and they wanted to rule and govern these areas. We will study that when we look at Naga insurgency, Ulfa's insurgency. These are all separatist movements. They wanted to break these areas away from India and form independent nations, which they could govern, which they could rule. So yes, many of these insurgents, they wanted territorial control. Kanchana is asking, sir, tomorrow what time will the class start? Tomorrow we will start a little early. We'll start at 7 a.m. because I would need a few extra hours to discuss and complete every topic. So we'll start by 7 a.m. and it will go on till 8 p.m. But don't worry, I'll give you sufficient breaks. Every 1 hour, 15 minutes, 1 hour, 30 minutes, we'll take a break. Because I know weekends can be very tough for you as well, right? Even I would need some rest. So we will take appropriate breaks. But it's important that we try and cover the syllabus tomorrow. Next, Prithvi is asking, sir, what do you mean by porous border? Porous means there are openings or gaps in the border, right? When we say a material is porous, what does it mean? It means there are holes in that material. There are gaps in that material. Similarly, in the border, there are few natural gaps. It is created by the local geography itself, right? Let's say in the border area, if it's a plain region, if it's just a plain grassland, it's easy to fence such an area, guard and protect those borders. But imagine a border where there are hills and mountains. Imagine a border where there are multiple rivers, dense forests, remote areas. How will you guard every area in that border? You can't deploy troops everywhere. It's impossible, right? These are borders which stretch to thousands of kilometers. You can't fence the whole border. Again, it's physically impossible. So such a border with a complex geography is called a porous border, meaning there are gaps in the border. So these criminals and extremists, they exploit those gaps to infiltrate. In fact, most of India's borders are porous. India-Nepal border, India-Bangladesh border, India-Myanmar border, even India-Pakistan border, right? We'll get more insight into this tomorrow when we discuss border management. So I'll take you through the different borders of India. So there you'll get a better idea about the porous nature of these boundaries. Any other question? A student is asking, sir, please elaborate about insurgency. See, we are already way past the halfway mark. We have completed almost 50% of the syllabus. We have discussed insurgency in detail over the last weekend, right? We will cover insurgency going forward because in this chapter, we will be discussing Northeast insurgency. But repeating what is insurgency again is impossible. It's like listening to Ramayana, Mahabharata, and then asking who's Rama, who's Krishna, right? It becomes impossible to go back to the basics again to repeat it. We have done this last week. You have recorded classes. Please go back and watch it because it's a very big discussion. We had an elaborate discussion on what is insurgency, how is it different from terrorism. But don't worry, you will get an idea again because we are still dealing with Northeast insurgency. So you will get an idea. And to cover the basics, please go back and watch last weekend's class. All right. So let's begin with Nagaland. Let's take a look at Naga insurgency. See, this refers to the insurgency led by an ethnic group called the Nagas. Now, the question is, who are the Nagas? The Nagas are a major ethnic group in Northeast India. They are not just found in today's Nagaland. Don't assume that Nagas are limited to Nagaland. That's a common misconception. The term Naga refers to a very large ethnic group. Within the Naga community, there are many sub-Naga groups and Naga clans. Is that clear? And they are spread out all across the region. They are not just limited to today's Nagaland, as you see in the map. You can find the subgroups and subclans of Nagas in Assam, in Manipur, even in parts of Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, and more importantly, there are few subclans of Nagas found in the neighboring country of Myanmar. This is the spread of the Naga community. Got it? The term Naga refers to a broad, large ethnic group, mainly concentrated in today's Nagaland, but other subgroups and clans are found in other states as well, including across the border in Myanmar. So we are referring to this major community in Northeast India. Now, why did Naga insurgency begin? On what ground? What were the factors? See, most ethnic groups and indigenous tribes, they are known for their fighting skills, their martial skills. Since ethnic groups and indigenous tribes are very protective of their land, their resources and identity, right? And since they face a lot of threats as well, because these ethnic groups and tribes, they have resided in these forests for centuries. So this is their homeland. So they have to protect it at any cost. So they face natural threats from disasters, from the environment, from wild animals, and they have faced threats from other tribes and from outsiders. So naturally, most of the ethnic tribes and ethnic groups, right, they have great war fighting skills. They specialize in martial skills, that is war fighting skills. They specialize in jungle warfare. And the Nagas have been known as specialists in jungle warfare. It is something that is integral to their culture, right? It is seen as an essential part of protecting their groups and clans from any kind of outside threat. So they know how to hide in the jungle, survive in the jungle, and how to defend their people and their land. So this is a skill that has been passed down from generations and generations over centuries. But the British, right, who extended their influence towards Northeast India, they were smart enough to notice this war fighting skill of the Nagas. They recognized that amongst all the other tribes and ethnic groups in Northeast India, Nagas were the most proficient in jungle warfare. Be it their fitness, physical and mental fitness, their ability to merge with the jungle, hide and survive in the jungle and fight was something that was remarkable, and this was noticed by the British. What did they do? They obviously exploited the skill. When the First World War had broken out, when Britain was facing a grave threat from the Axis powers in Europe, it relied heavily on Indian soldiers. I hope you know this. India has made an enormous contribution to both World War I and World War II. You may not have studied this in school, but this is a underappreciated part of Indian history. Be it men, material, and money, India has been one of the biggest provider with regard to the allied efforts during both the world wars. In terms of money, which funded the war, a lot of that wealth came from India. Right? Britain managed to fund the wars by looting India, by exploiting India economically. It looted resources from India, from clothing material to material needed for fighting the war, was largely procured from India. And even the soldiers, the men who fought the war for the British, right, who were part of the British Indian Army, they were all Indians, Indian soldiers. So Indian soldiers have contributed enormously to the war efforts, both in First and Second World War, and they have fought in different countries, different theaters of conflict, from Europe to West Asia to Southeast Asia. They have fought in France. They have fought in today's Israel, in Egypt. They have fought in Singapore, in Myanmar. So around the world, Indian soldiers were used by the British to fight this war. So as part of these war efforts, the British had recruited the Naga soldiers to utilize their jungle warfare skills, their guerrilla warfare skills. The British further trained them like a special force. They gave them modern military training and turned them into commandos. Is that clear? Military level training was provided to them by the British, which further enhanced their warfighting skills to suit modern warfare. They were trained on how to handle weapons, how to collect intelligence, how to carry out surveillance, how to establish communication. So all such modern methods of warfare was taught to the Naga special forces, which were raised as commando units to engage in guerrilla warfare against the enemy forces. And these Naga commandos were deployed around the world. They fought for the British and they contributed immensely to the war efforts. So now these soldiers who came back to India, right after the First World War, who returned in 1918, they came back with tremendous wartime knowledge. They not only had better military skills because of all the training and the actual experience of fighting a war, but now they had better political and social awareness because they had fought in faraway countries with different political systems, with different complex social systems. They started realizing how nation states are formed around the world. They started understanding the concept of nationalism. They realized that in Europe and in other parts of the world, countries are created on the basis of religion, on the basis of race, ethnicity, language, etc. That is how most countries have been created. Most countries are homogeneous, formed of one major community, one majority community. Some countries are built on the basis of religion, the majority religion. Some are built on the basis of majority language, majority ethnicity, majority race, etc. So the Naga soldiers who came back, they realized that their community has a distinct ethnic, cultural identity, right? They became politically aware, socially aware that their community is different, ethnically different from other tribes, other groups in Northeast India. They also realized they are different from rest of India. They had nothing in common historically, culturally with the rest of India. By then, our freedom struggle was gaining momentum, right? By 1918, Mahatma Gandhi had entered our freedom struggle following the Swadeshi boycott movement, the partition of Bengal. Our freedom struggle had gained a fresh momentum, and different communities were coming together to drive India's freedom struggle. So, day by day, it was getting clear that India will eventually gain independence. So, these Naga soldiers who were politically aware, who realized their distinct ethnic identity, they raised a political demand with the British. They expected this as a return favor because they had helped the British Indian Army to fight the First World War, contributed to their war efforts. Now, in return, the Naga soldiers who had come back with political knowledge, with greater military skills, they raised a genuine, legitimate demand that Naga areas should be a separate country if Britain grants independence to India. This was a clear nationalistic goal that was expressed by the Nagas. These soldiers who returned, they formed an informal club called the Naga Club. Understood? The Naga soldiers who came back from the First World War, they formed the Naga Club in 1918, which started acting as the political representative of the Naga community itself. Their demand was very straightforward. That see, around the world we have realized that countries are formed on the lines of ethnicity, language, religion, etc. So tomorrow, if Britain is granting independence to India, please ensure that Naga areas are not merged with India, because we have nothing in common with the rest of the country. Nagas are a distinct ethnic group. We want our own country. We want a separate nation state built on Naga cultural identity and ethnic identity. This was the demand raised by Naga Club. Now, at this point, this was understandable. It was not a unreasonable demand. Why? Because before independence, many communities were fighting for their own rights, either on religious lines or on ethnic lines, linguistic lines, etc. Right? Just like the Sikhs were worried what will happen to them between Hindus and Muslims, between India and Pakistan. This was again a legitimate, genuine concern of the Nagas. They said, we don't have much in common with the rest of the country and we would like to be independent. We would like to form a separate nation based on our ethnic lines. Now, this demand was encouraged by the British. This was also their policy of divide and rule. Now, members of Naga Club, right, who had become more active in raising the political demand, they met with Simon Commission when it visited India. Right? You would have studied in modern history, in polity as well, as to why the Simon Commission came to India. Can anyone tell me in the comments? Why did the Simon Commission come to India? It came to India in 1929. But why? What was the reason? What was the mandate of Simon Commission? Meghna says to write the constitution. Pooja says constitutional reform. Very good, you are correct. But can you give me the exact answer? Very good. Nikhil has given the right answer. To review the Government of India Act 1919, also called as Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, which was the then constitution of the country. Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms of 1919, also known as the Government of India Act. It had a provision that 1 decade after its implementation, there will be a commission to review the functioning of the constitution and suggest constitutional reforms. So, according to this provision provided under the Government of India Act 1919, the Simon Commission was established in Britain and the commission visited India. The task of the commission was to meet with all the stakeholders and representatives in India to generate their political legal opinions regarding the next constitutional changes. So Simon Commission met with various princely states, with the leaders of the Indian National Congress, with different communities, and it also met with members of Naga Club. The former soldiers who had fought for Britain, who were leading the Naga Club, they met with Simon Commission and submitted a formal memorandum. They formally raised their demand for the first time in 1929, saying that Naga areas have to be kept separate from India. They reiterated the point to the British that tomorrow, if you guys are leaving the subcontinent, if you're granting independence, please ensure Naga areas are separate, shouldn't be merged with India, right? And in a way, the British kept encouraging the tendency. They didn't try to curb this at the root itself. Then came the Second World War. The Second World War had broken out. This time, India made an even bigger contribution for the British war efforts. More Indian soldiers were used by Britain. They were deployed around the world, including members of Naga Club. So Naga soldiers had again fought for the British as part of British Indian Army. So now they came back with even better wartime knowledge, with better negotiating skills, accompanied with military skills and political knowledge. So in 1946, after the war ended, they transformed the informal Naga Club and established a more formal political organization called Naga National Council. That is NNC. So Naga Club, which was an informal club of former soldiers, now became Naga National Council as a former political representative of the Naga community. By now, independence was just an eventuality because the wars had weakened Britain. Its economy had been destroyed. Its power was on the decline. After the World War, it was US and Soviet Union which became the next emergent superpowers. Britain could no longer control the colonies. It was very evident that Britain is going to leave its colonies. Our freedom struggle had succeeded. It had gained momentum. It had put pressure on the British Raj. It was only a matter of time that India would have gained independence. At this crucial juncture, the NNC raised the demand again. That see, you're about to give independence to India. We realize that. Please ensure Naga areas are not merged with India. Is that clear? But this demand was outright rejected by Indian leaders. The leaders of Indian National Congress rejected this demand and they put pressure on Britain to never concede independence to any territory. Because if the tendency was encouraged, if the demand was met, then tomorrow every other community will have similar demands. We've already studied in previous classes how we had problems in integrating certain princely states. Nizam of Hyderabad would create problems. The Nawab of Junagadh would create problems. Raja Hari Singh created problems. Many other kingdoms, from Travancore to Mysore, Bhopal, Indore, many of the princely states were hesitant to join. There were different linguistic groups, religious groups, ethnic and caste-based groups. Even they would have raised similar demands. So we didn't want to set a wrong example, a wrong precedent. There were many other tribes and ethnic groups in Northeast India. They would have also raised similar demands. In fact, such demands were there in Manipur. In Mizoram, there was hesitance to join Indian Union. So Indian leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, Sardar Patel, and all the others, they rejected the demand. They said this can't be met. If we start accepting this demand, then tomorrow everybody will ask for such independence and India will never be formed. India will never be a strong union. So by putting pressure back on the British, India ensured that such demands are not met. So what the British did was they tried to strike a compromise, as they have always done. Basically, wherever they go, they create a mess and leave behind the mess, and they push this on the local people to deal with. Be it problems in Africa, Israel-Palestine issue, problems in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, everything is a colonial blunder. The Naga insurgency can be traced to this as well. If the British were smart administrators, they should have shut down the demand long ago, right? But they kept encouraging the demand until 1947. Now, when the Naga demand had become stronger, and since there was opposition from India to satisfy the demand, the British, they tried to strike a compromise. This compromise is called the Akbar-Haidari Agreement, the 9-point agreement. Akbar Haidari was the then governor of Assam. He was the British representative in Assam. And don't forget, Naga areas were part of the large province of Assam. And also, interestingly, Akbar Haidari is the grandfather of the popular Bollywood actress Aditi Rao Haidari. So this is the individual I'm referring to. He was the then governor of Assam, the British representative here. So he reached out to the Naga National Council, engaged in talks, and arrived at a settlement. A 9-point agreement was finalized. This was June 1947, just few months before India's independence. Under the 9-point agreement, the governor, that is the British representative, made it clear that, see, independence cannot be given. It's not possible to meet your demand for independence because Indian leaders will not agree to it. Neither is Britain agreeing to it completely. So we cannot provide independence at any cost. Sorry. But however, we will satisfy some of your demands by giving you autonomy in the future Indian constitution. The Indian constitution which will be drafted will include special provision, special protection to give you some kind of autonomy so that you can look after your administration, look after your own lawmaking, protect your land, your rights, and your culture. Now, this was actually an acceptable solution. It was a well thought out solution as well. Right? The only problem here was that before this, the British had actively encouraged their independence demands. If they hadn't done that, maybe things would have been different. See, India's constitution is a phenomenal document. There might be shortcomings, but the flexibility of Indian constitution is something that needs to be appreciated. If India has remained as a strong union, it has thrived as a country despite all the diversity, right? Large part of the credit goes to the constitution, our founding fathers and the constitution framers. The constitution, which was eventually adopted in 1950, it had inbuilt flexible provisions through which such special status, special provisions could be provided. That is how Article 370 was added, to give special status to J&K. Or else Raja Hari Singh would have thought twice about signing the instrument of accession. He wanted his people in J&K to be protected, right? That is why the demand was raised. Similar demands were there in Northeast India, and we have given autonomy to many parts of Northeast India. This does not affect or threaten our integrity, our sovereignty. Those areas will remain a part of Indian sovereignty, but the control of the government of India will be limited to few subjects. Few subjects like defense, security, communication, external affairs. These subjects will be transferred to the center, and in all the other matters, autonomous councils will look after the administration. Be it local laws, even local taxation, basic welfare, development, management of land, management of revenue, all these matters will be delegated and autonomy can be given. Constitutional autonomy with constitutional status. So this was guaranteed that if you accept this, if you sign the deal, then India will provide special status to Naga areas in the future constitution. Autonomy will be provided with constitutional status. This was acceptable to Indian leaders as well. So the agreement was signed. NNC leaders and Akbar Hydari, the governor, they signed the agreement. But however, this deal was accepted only by the moderate Naga political leaders. Only they agreed to it and only they were party to it. Is that clear? It was rejected by the extremist elements who had become dominant within the NNC. Essentially, within NNC, there was a split, a division. There were few moderate and sane Naga leaders who realized that there is no point in fighting the British or in fighting India. Right? They would be much larger powers any day. Any such conflict would affect both the sides. And they understood that their rights, their concerns will be addressed, will be protected by providing constitutional autonomy. So the moderate leaders were agreeing to it, they were willing to accept, and they signed the 9-point agreement. But as usual, the extremists who were driven by their own agendas, they discarded the agreement. They rejected the Akbar Hydari agreement, they walked out of the deal. And NNC, which broke apart, it declared independence on 14th August 1947. These extremist Naga leaders, under the leadership of NNC, the breakaway faction, which was the extremist faction, they declared on 14th August 1947 that Naga areas are independent. This was unilateral declaration of independence right before India's independence. Basically, NNC was declaring war against India even before India was created. That's why I told you this insurgency predates India's independence. The roots are present in colonial India. So as soon as India became independent, we were already dealing with our first separatist movement. It was a separatist insurgent movement. The NNC wanted to fight for full-fledged independence. It wanted to liberate all the Naga areas from India and even from Burma, that's Myanmar, and unite all the Naga areas by liberating them from India and Myanmar to form the so-called Naga Lim. It basically refers to Greater Nagaland. This is the objective of Naga insurgents. Their goal is to form a Greater Nagaland known as Naga Lim. They want this to be a separate, sovereign, independent country. They want to form this by uniting all the Naga areas. So what does it mean? They want to break away not just today's Nagaland, but even other Naga areas from Assam, Arunachal, Manipur, Mizoram, and even the Naga areas in Myanmar. Break this away from India and Myanmar and form this separate nation, which they refer to as Naga Lim or Greater Nagaland. So this is how Naga insurgency broke out against India even before India itself was born. Understood? So this is the birth of Naga insurgency in the country. I hope this is clear till now. Let me know if you have any doubts, any questions. Otherwise, I can proceed from here. We'll discuss what happened later and we'll talk about the current situation. Let me know if you have any questions. All right. Many students are saying it's all clear, no issues, sir. Okay, perfect. Very good. Now, let's understand how the insurgency evolved, how India tried to tackle the threat. Naga insurgency started escalating day by day. In 1950s, it became a major armed movement. Very quickly, they got support. They managed to raise funds, access arms and weapons, primarily via East Pakistan and even from Myanmar. Is that clear? In East Pakistan, they established a few bases. Obviously, Pakistan wouldn't act against them because, given the hostility between India and Pakistan, Pakistan was directly or indirectly aiding these rebel groups. In Myanmar, they got support from the local Nagas. So they easily managed to raise funds and weapons to wage this war against India, and very quickly this became a major security threat in Assam. Because then Nagaland was still not created. Nagaland was created much later. You would have studied this in polity and modern history and post-independence history, right? The state of Nagaland was created much later in 1963. But in 1950s, it was still part of Assam, and this is where the insurgency had broken out. So to contain the threat, since there were cross-border factors involved, the Indian Army was deployed along with Assam Rifles. Assam Rifles was already deployed in the northeast since the British era. So along with Assam Rifles, which is a paramilitary border guarding force, Indian Army was deployed here in a counter-insurgency role to lead the counter-insurgency operations to target Naga insurgents. And this is where AFSPA was introduced for the first time after independence. We will discuss AFSPA later. I'll come to it. I'll explain the key provisions. But please note that AFSPA had been used in colonial India. During partition, it had been used temporarily in Punjab and Bengal to deal with communal violence. But after that, in post-independent India, AFSPA had not been used because it was a draconian law. It had very stringent provisions which could be misused. It had been used with the British to clamp down on our freedom struggle, to put down our freedom movement, to target our freedom fighters. There was no way that India would have continued this law. India didn't want to use this again. But the security threat posed by Nagas was getting serious day by day as they had cross-border support. And to deal with this, India brought back AFSPA by declaring these areas as disturbed area under the Disturbed Areas Act. It was declared a disturbed area and AFSPA was extended and implemented. So let's say UPSC asks you a prelims question stating that where was AFSPA used first in India to counter insurgency? The answer is the northeast, in Assam. Because back then, Naga areas were still part of Assam. So special powers were given to Indian Army and Assam Rifles by declaring the area as disturbed area, and this gave special powers to the Indian security forces to carry out these counter-insurgency operations. So as we stepped up the security efforts, we made a political attempt to defuse the movement. Indian government reached out to the Naga leaders to talk to them, to engage in negotiations with them. And a genuine attempt was made by India to strike peace. India showed willingness and flexibility by granting statehood in 1963, hoping that this would satisfy the insurgent movement, hoping that it would satisfy the insurgent leaders, right? We established a peace mission by carving out Naga land from Assam. From the large state of Assam, a few Naga areas, Naga-dominated areas were carved out to form the current state that you have, which is Nagaland. It was established in 1963, and an official peace mission was set up to talk to the Naga rebels. We were looking for a mediated settlement because parallelly, we were stepping up the security operations to weaken the outfit. See, this is one strategy India has always followed with insurgent groups. We never negotiate with any armed violent group when they are in a position of strength. Because in any negotiation, you should negotiate from a power of strength, from a position of strength. Because that will ensure that the bargaining power, the balance of the negotiation will be on your side, in your favor. Then you can dictate the terms of the negotiation. So India never negotiates with an armed group when they are at their peak, right? When they have maximum influence, when they're able to carry out major attacks. We never negotiate with them at that point. We use security operations to target such groups and weaken them. We break their influence, their presence. We bring down the group, and when they are at their weakest, that is when we open a dialogue with them. We want to ensure government is in a position of strength. The bargaining power should be with the government. But India has always shown the flexibility, the willingness to talk and give some concessions, including constitutional concessions if required. So a separate state was carved out of Assam, hoping that this would satisfy the political demands, and a peace mission was established. So these negotiations went on parallelly while the security operations were being carried out. But then came the biggest blow for Naga insurgents when India broke Pakistan into two parts in 1971. Until then, it was a major base for the NNC rebels. They were taking shelter here in East Pakistan, getting funds and weapons from Pakistani army and the ISI. Pakistan had already experimented with a covert war against India in 1960s by supporting NNC in East Pakistan. So when India liberated Bangladesh and broke Pakistan into two, it destroyed the support for NNC and forced them to agree to the Shillong Accord. This was a result of the peace talks. Through the negotiations that went on for so many years, we finalized the Shillong Accord in 1975. Is that clear? So through our security operations, we had weakened NNC. Negotiations had been opened, a separate state had been created to show that government is flexible to meet some of their demands. And parallelly, the support they lost in East Pakistan was a blessing to India because this weakened the movement and forced them to agree to the Shillong Accord of 1975. The Shillong Accord was very similar to Akbar-Hydari Agreement. Just like constitutional autonomy was promised, constitutional protection was guaranteed under the 9-point agreement, similar provisions were reiterated that Nagaland will be within Indian sovereignty, India will have full sovereignty, but many subjects will be devolved, delegated to the state, to the autonomous region, where constitutional protection would also be given through the constitution. This was the terms negotiated under Shillong Accord. But again, the Shillong Accord met with the same story, the same fate as that of 9-point agreement. It was accepted by some of the relatively moderate leaders, but it was rejected by the extremist, violent elements. Got it? India negotiated with all the Naga rebels, but some of them accepted the deal. The more moderate ones, right, who realized that this is the best solution, they were willing to accept and sign the Shillong Accord. But there were 3 extremist leaders, notorious insurgents, who refused to sign the deal. This included Isaac, Muiwa, and Kaplang. These are the names of 3 Naga insurgent leaders, Isaac, Muiwa, Kaplang. They rejected the deal. They wanted the war to continue. They wouldn't settle anything less than independence. So while some Naga moderate political leaders and moderate extremists were ready to accept this, ready to sign the Shillong Accord, the other extremists rejected it. They broke away from the deal. The NNC got dissolved after this. The NNC was dissolved after this division. And these 3 leaders, they established a new outfit called NSCN, the Nationalist Socialist Council of Nagaland, National Socialist Council of Nagaland. This is how NSCN was born in the year 1980. So this outfit took over Naga insurgency from here onwards. All right, the other NNC leaders had surrendered. They had ended their war. The political moderates also had given up their demands. The negotiations were succeeding with the Shillong Accord, we were expecting that peace and stability will be restored. But Isaac Muiwa Kaplang, these extremist leaders rejected the deal, broke from NNC, and formed a new insurgent group called NSCN by shifting base to Myanmar. Because they didn't have support in Bangladesh initially. The initial Bangladeshi government was pro-India. India had played a big role in liberating Bangladesh. They had lost their support bases. So these extremists, they shifted to Myanmar, and here they declared the formation of NSCN, National Socialist Council of Nagaland. And by using Myanmar as a base, they continued their war against India. So throughout 1980s, the violence increased and Naga insurgents became notorious and one of the most formidable threats for India. Is that clear? So in 1980s, India retaliated. India responded with enhanced security operations because that was the only way out. These extremists were not surrendering. They were not giving up their fight. So India stepped up the war against NSCN, targeted them, and we saw that the group split in 1988. This outfit, it split into two different factions because of differences that had come up between the leaders. Isaac and Muiwa, they shifted base to Bangladesh again because Bangladesh had become hostile to India once again. Under military rule, under a pro-Pakistan government, Bangladesh had turned hostile again. And Isaac and Muiwa, they broke away from Kaplang because they had ideological differences on how to run the organization and on what to demand from India. These differences split the group into NSCN-IM and NSCN-K. Isaac and Muiwa shifted base to Bangladesh and took support even from Pakistan here. They got support from Pakistan and Bangladesh to continue this war against India. That is the IM faction, the NSCN-IM faction. Kaplang, however, remained in Myanmar and continued the war against India from Myanmar. So now we had two different groups to deal with. NSCN-IM based out of Bangladesh with support from Bangladesh and Pakistan. NSCN-K or NSCN-Kaplang based out of Myanmar. So as India targeted both the groups, our security forces, intelligence agencies, they achieved success. We weakened these outfits and we forced them to sign ceasefire agreements with India. The NSCN-IM signed a ceasefire agreement in 1997, and few years later, NSCN-Kaplang also signed a ceasefire agreement in 2001. Now you might be hoping that the Naga insurgency might come to an end, that things would stabilize and normalize. But unfortunately, that didn't happen again. These groups, they broke the ceasefire. They were only signing the ceasefire to buy time, to regroup and build their strength. They broke the ceasefire and continued the war. This conflict went on, and many new factions also came up, like NSCN Kole Kitovi faction and many others. Today, there are at least 7 to 8 different NSCN factions. Especially the Kaplang faction in Myanmar has split mainly due to differences between the top leaders, and every guy has formed their own NSCN outfit. So like this, there are few minor NSCN factions, but the major ones are NSCN-IM and NSCN-K. So this war continued all the way until 2009. Both the groups were a major threat. Apart from the smaller factions like Kole Kitovi faction, major threat was from IM and Kaplang. These two factions posed the biggest threat. But the year 2009 was a turning point for India. It was a turning point because in Bangladesh, there was a very big positive development. Sheikh Hasina, a very close friend of India, won the elections. She brought Awami League back into power with complete majority. She formed a strong government and immediately she started favoring India. This was the breakthrough that India was waiting for, a massive breakthrough. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina helped India. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the then Prime Minister, reached out to Sheikh Hasina's government, and with the help of Bangladesh, we managed to wipe out the support bases that existed in Bangladesh. All the Northeast insurgents who were hiding, they were targeted in Bangladesh. Is that clear? And it was not just NSC and IM which was targeted by Bangladesh. There were many other insurgent groups which were also targeted. There was ULFA, which was hiding in Bangladesh, NDFB, and few other groups. They were all hiding in Bangladesh. So with the arrival of a friendly government under Awami League, under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the Manmohan Singh government immediately started cooperating, and we stepped up our security defense relations. Border security was improved. The cross-border infiltration was curbed. Intelligence sharing started improving. Our intelligence agencies, security forces, they started cooperating with each other. And Bangladesh destroyed the terror safe havens, the terror sanctuaries that Pakistan had created. The supply of weapons was cut, supply of funds was cut. The top leaders were arrested and handed over to India. The leaders of Isaac Muiva, NSCN IM, was completely dismantled by Bangladesh, and the top leaders were handed over to India. This was the big success for India. With this, we brought down NSCN IM, but NSCN Kaplang remained active in Myanmar. So by 2009, we saw the weakening of NSCN IM faction, and we started negotiating with this faction of NSCN. India opened a political dialogue with NSCN IM and other Naga political groups. The Naga Students Union and few other political groups that represented the Naga community, they were brought into a dialogue with NSCN IM, and Government of India started negotiating with them. In 2015, a historic framework agreement was signed to start the Naga peace process. The Naga peace process was initiated in 2015 between the Government of India, Government of Nagaland, because obviously state government will also be involved, and the negotiations began with NSCN IM, the leaders of IM who were handed over to India, who had been arrested, and with other Naga political groups and representatives. So this was a historic deal. In fact, it was signed in front of Prime Minister Modi. It was such a big initiative to begin, because this was our oldest insurgency and we were on the verge of bringing this to an end. The peace process officially started with the signing of this framework agreement. So the Prime Minister himself was present with leaders of NSC and IM. He shared the stage with the insurgents when we signed the deal, and this began the process of talks. Is that clear? These talks and negotiations are still continuing. Continuing as of 2023. So it means that we haven't managed to work out a peace deal yet. That is the concluding point. It's been 8 years since the framework agreement on the peace process was signed, the peace process was initiated. Representatives of the Indian government and the state government are talking with leaders of NSC and IM and the political groups and representatives to strike a peace deal. There have been many ups and downs, many controversies related to the peace process. Because of this, there has been a delay And some experts are saying that the peace process has been derailed as well. Is that clear? But India is still hopeful that we will strike a peace deal, and the negotiations are continuing as of now. The deal is yet to be signed, the final peace accord is yet to be finalized, but the talks, negotiations are continuing. But of course, it has been hit by delays, there have been controversies, there have been ups and downs in the negotiation process. We will understand this after a break. We will take a short break. Right after that, I'll explain why the peace process has hit a dead end, why the peace process has not continued, why the deal has not been finalized. We'll discuss that later after the break. But before the break, I want to mention one very important point. Obviously, some of you might be thinking, what happened to the other faction, the Kaplang faction? I told you that it was based out of Myanmar. It broke into multiple factions as well. So what happened to this group of NSCN? This faction of NSCN has not surrendered, meaning it is continuing its war against India. So NSCN Kaplang remains a threat. It has rejected the peace process. Please write down this point. NSCN Kaplang has rejected the peace process, and in fact, when the framework agreement was signed in 2015, it opposed the starting of the peace dialogue. Is that clear? The NSCN Kaplang faction even retaliated against India for starting the peace process, for signing the framework agreement. It carried out a major attack in 2015 against the Indian Army. It targeted a convoy of the Indian Army near the Myanmar border and killed multiple Indian soldiers to mark its opposition to the Naga peace process. Because Kaplang faction has not surrendered. It is still in a state of war, continuing its insurgency against India by basing itself in Myanmar. India has reasons to believe that China is covertly backing NSCN Kaplang. Chinese intelligence agencies, the Ministry of State Security, is believed to supply funds and weapons to NSCN Kaplang via Myanmar's territory. Is that clear? Now, I'm sure many of you would be aware of the incident, or at least you would have at least come across this incident. Have you seen the movie Uri, based on the surgical strikes India carried out against Pakistan, right, which stars Vicky Kaushal? I'm sure many of you would have seen it. This movie, it opens with a scene from Northeast India, if you remember. If you don't, after the class, go back and watch it. The opening scene begins along the Manipur-Myanmar border. In the Manipur border sector, you have places like Chandel. In the Chandel district, we have something called Ukrul sector. It's a border area, a very sensitive border area between Manipur and Myanmar. So in the Chandel district, near the Ukrul sector, an Indian army convoy was passing, which is depicted in the movie as well. And all of a sudden, there is an ambush attack, right? Insurgents who are hiding, they detonate explosive and they mount a major ambush attack, killing multiple Indian army soldiers. This incident that you see in the movie, it's not fictional, it's a real incident. This is the attack I'm talking about. That attack that you see in the movie, Uri, which is the opening scene as well, it is nothing but the attack carried out by NSCN Kaplang. It was in 2015, it was a retaliation, a direct retaliation against the framework agreement for the peace process, which was signed between Indian government and NSCN IM and other Naga groups. Since Kaplang faction is opposed to any talks with India, it wants to continue the war against India, it carried out the attack against the Indian army. This was one of the biggest losses suffered by Indian army during peacetime. So within few days, India retaliated with a surgical strike inside Myanmar's territory. special forces of Indian Army from the Para SF, the Para Commandos, they infiltrated into Myanmar, reportedly with Myanmar's permission, because we have a history of collaboration with Myanmar's army when it comes to counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. So, with cooperation from Myanmar, Indian special forces infiltrated into Myanmar's territory a few kilometers inside Myanmar to conduct a surgical strike against the terror camps of NSC and Kaplang. In the movie Uri as well, this surgical strike is depicted. Right? Then the scene shifts to Uri attacks and the surgical strikes against Pakistan. But it begins with Northeast India and Myanmar, and these are real incidents, which is exactly what I'm talking about. So Indian Army retaliated with a surgical strike, targeting multiple camps of the Kaplang faction, killing several insurgents belonging to NSC and Kaplang. So all these groups are designated as terrorist organizations under the UAPA. Even though technically they are insurgent groups because of their demands and the way they operate, the way they are structured. But India doesn't look at them as insurgent groups. We treat them as terrorist organizations because they have committed major acts of violence. They have killed our security forces, killed civilians, threatened our security and integrity, and they're getting cross-border support. So the MHA has correctly classified them as terrorist outfits. Got it? So this is where I would like to stop. We can take a short break. We'll come back and we will discuss why the peace process has not been finalized, why the peace deal has not been worked out, what has happened, what's the delay, what's the controversy around it. So that will complete this topic, and then we can talk about insurgency in Assam. So take a 15 minutes break, rest for 15 minutes, come back at 6:35. All right, we'll continue till 8. We'll try to wrap up insurgency in Assam as well. We'll try to complete Assam so that tomorrow we have only few topics left from Northeast insurgency. So I'll see you back in 15 minutes.